When we talk about the climate governance in the country, it is also important at the outset, also making a statement because the climate governance is also pretty new in the country because it's a process that has only been started nearly a decade ago. So if there are any decisions that don't go well, there should be a tribunal where these decisions can be challenged because we are not talking about a small amount of money. We are talking about the needs of 348 billion that Pakistan needs by 2030.
From my perspective, climate is one of those particular sectors, or at least larger areas of policy making, that require a lot of proactive approach rather than waiting for one good policy making actor to come up and say that you have to do this.
So Bangladesh is a very good example. The Bangladesh does comprehensive climate budget tagging because that's in a way also provides a roadmap to different sectors and departments at the federal level in terms of aligning their targets and projects with the NDCs that we have in place.
Hello and welcome to Front Seat to Climate Change. We continue our conversations on matters relating to climate and the overall policymaking sphere. And today we're going to be discussing climate governance in Pakistan. With me is Kashif Ali from Transparency International Pakistan. He's the Executive Director in the Pakistan office and has been doing some substantial work around policy making overall and particularly over the last 2-3 years on climate governance. Welcome to the show, Kashif. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Dawar, for having me.
It's good to have you because I know we have had these conversations informally and also worked on a couple of things relating to climate governance. Starting from the very overall broad view, when we talk about governance in Pakistan, there's some general issues. Do you think that without addressing these issues, we can have a good climate governance framework in place? And what is the current status of that framework itself?
Yeah. I mean, when we talk about the climate governance in the country, it's also important at the outset to also make a statement because the climate governance is also pretty new in the country because it's a process that has only been started nearly a decade ago. But I think in the current space, as it looks like, it's a federation-led system where we have the Ministry of Climate Change in place at the federal level, and then at the provincial level, the provincial environmental departments and the climate change departments are in place. But I think essentially when we look at this climate governance domain as a whole, and then we have this Climate Change Act 2017, which is an umbrella legislative framework through which the climate governance issues are regulated. And within that, I mean, Climate Change Act 2017, I think it provides a model where there are a very significant gaps, but also there are strengths as well. So for example, one of the gaps that we tried to look at from the assessment that we did together was also that despite the fact that this Climate Change Act was passed in 2017, till 2024, we didn't have the Climate Change Authority in place. We didn't have the Climate Change Council convening frequently, which is a policy platform that provides an opportunity for provinces and the sectors to come together to see how to meet the NDC targets. But I think in the last few months before the COP29, there have been some of the good things that have been done in the climate governance space. So we see there is an active involvement of judiciary in this space. The Climate Change Authority became operational. The judiciary came to the forefront. But I mean, in terms of the legislative framework, also there are also inherent problems in my interpretation and also from the assessment that we did. So, for example, the Climate Change Authority it envisions the establishment of the Climate Change Fund. The Climate Change Fund says that all the grants that are received around climate finance will be deposited or within the Climate Change Fund. But then I think from the transparency point of view, the kind of impunity that has been given to the Climate Change Authority in terms of if there are decisions that are made in good faith, that is something that as a civil society, I think it raises the concerns around transparency and accountability for the utilization of climate finance because I mean what the model should be there because the Climate Change Authority now have the experts in place in form of members of adaptation, mitigation and coordination. So if there are any decisions that don't go well, there should be a tribunal where these decisions can be challenged,
Yeah.
because we are not talking about a small amount of money. We are talking about the needs of 348 billion that the Pakistan needs by 2030. So there is a huge amount of money potentially that is involved here. And within that climate governance, I think frameworks, so these issues on in terms of the gaps are something that I see. And then secondly, I think if we look at the provincial level, so all the provinces now have the climate change policies in place. The Punjab and the Balochistan only had recently
Yes.
passed their climate change policies. In particular, the Punjab being the biggest province, and also the province that has a lot of climate vulnerabilities being faced. But since 2017, we have been relying on the internal draft, the policy, and all these policies to some extent have a citizen inclusion component. But in practice, I think to what extent are we ensuring that the citizen involvement in the climate decision takes place in reality is something also is a challenge, I think, in our climate governance space.
So I think since we've touched on the very foundational legislation, and maybe even if we go back to 1997 when PIPA came, the Pakistan Environment Protection Act, a lot of these policy documents are basically reactive, because that document in 97 came when Pakistan went to Rio and signed the UNFCCC, and then in 2017, 20 years after, we wanted to a climate change law, because in Paris we had signed some agreements which required the NDC, which meant federal level coordination, and without a legislation it could not happen. Similarly, the Punjab policy, which you were mentioning, the Balochistan policy, these came about as outcomes of court orders. They were forcing the provincial governments to come up because this is a legislation that is required. And it's the same case with the Climate Change Fund. So from my perspective, climate is one of those particular sectors, or at least larger areas of policy making, that require a lot of proactive approach rather than waiting for one good policy-making actor to come up and say that you have to do this. So I think that's one key area that we lack, because most of it is reactive. The second is, of course, the duplication of work and the lack of transparency when it comes to the finances. There's also a big question that you're setting up a climate change fund, but at the same time you have the NDRMF, which is also a fund that receives climate grants. Then you have the provincial endowment funds or green funds, which are giving green facilities, green credit, and they will also be getting grants from donors. So there's a lot of this lack of clarity as well. So lack of clarity and lack of transparency before even we've gotten a substantial quantum of money. So this essentially is, I think, one of the areas that is a constant mystery for me. And linked to that, in the assessment, we also came up with this number that this is the amount of money that we see that on average Pakistan is receiving. So what is the status of that? And given all of these issues in place, do you think the quantum of money will increase, or we will still see a lag in climate finance coming to Pakistan?
Yeah. So I think from the climate finance perspective, so on one hand, we have this figure that's coming from the World Bank in terms of the need, which is a 348 billion by 2030. But I think when we look at in terms of the financial inflows in the country, so we did this assessment early this year in April that shows in the last decade or so, Pakistan has received on average between 1.4 to 2.0 billion per year. And compared to the needs, the amount is significantly lower. So and I think also if you look at it in context of the COP29 conversations and the outcome of the COP29, so I think one thing is pretty clear, that the money is not there. And we have to look for the innovative financing mechanisms. And in our case also, I think what has happened from the limited money, the climate finance access that we have, the large amount of money is form of the IDA, the International Development Assistance, or in other words, is the debt financing projects.
I think there was this report in the same year that said that Egypt is number 1, Sri Lanka number 2, and Pakistan is number 3 in terms of debt-oriented climate finance.
Yes, yes. And then secondly, I think in terms of the other financial instruments that we look, so in Pakistan, so we know there's a lot of bilateral funding that is available. And in terms of the bilateral funding, if you look, there is a major, I think, tilt towards the mitigation. And I think it's also another important argument that Pakistan being a less than 1% of the contributor, do we need more adaptation or the mitigation? But then we have the bilateral funding, and then we have also the GCF projects going on at the moment. So I think in terms of the overall climate finance landscape, so I think one particular thing that the federal government that we saw also pushing from the COP29 is on the carbon credits, and looking at these carbon markets as a potential source of generating climate finance revenues. And then the good, I think, precedent in this regard is the launching of the carbon credit guidelines. But this draft is not yet publicly available, and that's something I think is the problem or the gap within our climate governance space. That why are we not taking the private sector, the industry, the civil society, the citizens on board when such new policies are drafted? So from our end at Transparency International Pakistan, we did take up a matter that the carbon markets also consist of enormous risk in terms of whether the projects will actually contribute to the emission reductions, because in a lot of countries there is a strong evidence available that these projects didn't contribute. So there is a need to have a strong third-party validation in place. There is a need to have a strong verification processes so that the companies or the project developers are not the ones who are also auditing. And I think more importantly also, because we also have to see that in order to make sure that this climate finance reach to the communities who are most affected by it, there has to be a benefit sharing mechanism. So for example, if you look at in Kenya, around 10% of the revenue that is generated from the carbon market projects is spent on the social welfare of those communities. And the social welfare means that could be the construction of the roads, the hospitals, the schools, and we need some mechanisms, because in the coming months, as these carbon guidelines will be translated in the formulation of the business rules, and if Pakistan is targeting, let's say 2-3 transactions up till COP 2030, it's important that how do we shield these projects against any integrity risk. But on the climate finance also, I think from the governance point of view, it's also important to see that essentially this climate finance is being utilized under the existing public financial management system. Yes. Now, within that public financial management system that we have, it's a very complex system, more or less similar at the federal and provincial level. But there are inbuilt, citizen participation, transparency metrics. But then there are also areas which are significantly weak when it comes to climate governance and finance. So I'll give you one example. So for example, whenever the new projects are designed, we now have mandatory provisions in place in form of environmental impact assessments and the environmental impact social assessments. But then in reality, when these projects are implemented at the grassroots level, do we take communities on board in terms of having redressal grievance mechanisms? And this is something we did with the province of Balochistan, when in July this year the Balochistan adopted its first climate change policy. We did make sure that we advocate with the provincial government, and the Balochistan climate change policy includes number of such mechanisms on the citizen inclusion, on having a grievance hotline at the Chief Minister office or at the provincial disaster management office, where the citizens' concerns can be taken on board.
So I think you've highlighted some very key problems, and at the end you're also mentioning one solution that is available. So I think to conclude, what would be 2 to 3 major prescriptions to the problems you've mentioned around lack of transparency? Then particularly you touched upon the combination of existing issues in the PFM system, which will translate into system issues for climate finance as well, particularly carbon markets. And then the last, in terms of legislation, what could be things, particularly when we talk about the impunity given to certain funds? How can we move beyond these issues?
Yeah. So I think I would highlight 3 things. So first, for us, to take the global community to take it seriously, we have to make sure that the climate is on the public policy agenda. And that means the tone has to be set at the top in terms of the budgetary allocations, in terms of the planning processes, and within what you said about the public financial management systems. So we see that right from the top when budgetary plans are made. So for the first time in the 2024 budget, the climate tagging is there. There's a chapter on climate change, and the federal government has done in terms of how much funds are being allocated on gender, climate, and SDGs. So that's, I think, is a step in the right direction. But then this climate budget tagging has to be made publicly available, because within the internal accounting system of the provincial government, this is happening. So Bangladesh is a very good example. The Bangladesh does comprehensive climate budget tagging, because that's in a way also provides a roadmap to different sectors and departments at the federal level in terms of aligning their targets and projects with the NDCs that we have in place. Yeah. So first on that. Secondly, I think when we talk about the climate finance, what we have also seen is that the huge money is utilized through the procurement processes. And in order to have the climate responsive procurement is also key. In our case, we have the federal procurement rules, we have the provincial procurement rules, and these rules contain certain transparency metrics, such as public disclosure to information, such as integrity pacts. Within the climate space, these tools have not been utilized yet. This is the, I think, condition of the IMF program that the federal government has signed in October this year, that the IMF requires the CPMI approach to the public sector spending. So a lot of this is going to be done because now the IMF is asking us to do that. And thirdly, I think on the climate data disclosure. So when we did this assessment also, the climate finance data is not publicly available.
Not centralized anywhere.
So no one knows in the country which climate projects are going on, because with information, the oversight comes. And there also, I think we have the good frameworks in place, such as right to information. We have currently, last month, did the assessment of the state of data disclosure, looking at the websites of different departments that have the work aligned with the climate change. So data disclosure, compliance with the procurement rules, and making sure that our climate agenda has, a key part within the top level climate budgeting processes that we have in place will help both, I think, in building trust among the donor communities, but also trust and confidence among the citizens.
No, thanks a lot. I think that's quite a detailed description. And with that, on that, I think, very prescriptive note, we will conclude this episode. And hopefully we continue these conversations, and lucky to have our audience members here. See you in the next episode.